Some parts of the world, public places are insisting that you have a vaccination certificate before you're allowed in. Here, we're seeing the Labour Department already issuing a circular saying that workplace health and safety committees can decide that someone must be vaccinated to continue working. It's a conversation that we've seen in various forms with different role players saying different things, including the South African Human Rights Commission, our Labour Department and the trade union movement. Well, one person who's been following this very closely, a very informed view, is Professor Halton Cheadle, Professor Emeritus at the University of Cape Town, a practicing attorney at BCHC Attorneys. Professor Cheadle, good afternoon to you. You believe that government could insist people get a vaccine. You're not suggesting they should necessarily, we'll come to that, but you're saying if government wanted to, it could make vaccination mandatory. Why do you believe that?
Well, it can make it mandatory through law, on the basis that no right is absolute, and the two rights that are impacted on by a mandatory vaccination program would be the right to bodily integrity in Section 12 of the Constitution and the right to beliefs and religious beliefs. And so both those rights would be infringed by a mandatory vaccination program. But the Constitution permits laws to limit rights, and they may be limited if they are reasonable and can be justified, if they're proportional and take into account the importance of the purpose of the limitation. In this case, the limiting the pandemic, if not ending it, and that there are no less restrictive ways of dealing with it. And we've seen that although everyone's obliged to wear masks and social distancing, also infringements of freedom of movement and bodily integrity, but they do work, and that's why they're mandatory. But the vaccination is clearly proving to be very effective in preventing serious illness and fatalities. So from a public health perspective, as opposed to a workplace perspective, mass vaccination means, of course, a reduction on pressure in ICU units and hospital beds, and that's a very important public health consideration.
So, I mean, in the end, I suppose what this might be about, Professor, is around you've got people who believe there's an absolute right to something, and the limitations clause in the Constitution, and you're the lawyer and the professor, not me. So it's really about how we manage the limitations clause, because there are quite a few people who would suggest it would be wrong and unconstitutional to force someone to undergo a medical procedure. Now, I know there's case law. One person was forced to undergo an operation to remove a bullet from their leg. The bullet was actually evidence against them. I don't know if that is relevant here. But the point is that people believe that you cannot be forced to get an injection, and a vaccine is an injection. You suggest that right to bodily integrity is not, I suppose, unlimited.
Yes, absolutely. It is. It's the same thing as seatbelts. So the rights can be limited, and I think in my article I make the point that probably the most conservative constitutional courts in the world, that's the U.S. Supreme Court, have very little difficulty in recognizing the importance of the pressing public interest in limiting religious rights, for example. Of course, always one must bear in mind that there are some people who medically can't take vaccinations, and they clearly are always an exception.
In a way, Professor Cheadle, I mean, people have different views of history, but you're one of the people who essentially wrote the Labour Relations Act. Many people say you are the person who wrote the Labour Relations Act. It's the act we still use. Do you believe...
I must deny that. It was. There were many authors. I was just merely the convener of the team that drafted it. So it's like, says Tutankhamun built the pyramid, but he didn't.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. Thank you. I suppose the question really is, do you believe it's possible for a workplace to demand that you get a vaccination? The Labour Department seems to believe it. COSATU, and I was very interested in this, the union movement, the biggest union movement we have, also agrees with the Labour Department that a workplace, through a health and safety committee, not a manager, through a health and safety committee, could demand that a worker get vaccinated.
Well, I think, first of all, the employer has the primary duty under Section 8 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And where there are health and safety committees, remember, health and safety committees are required in workplaces with more than 50 workers. And an employer is obliged to engage with the health and safety committee on whether or not to make it mandatory. And accordingly, yes. So the answer is very emphatic yes.
So, I mean, do they have a duty to do that, to demand that you get a vaccination?
The employer has a duty to take reasonable measures to keep the workplace health and safe. Also has an obligation to discuss any of those measures with a health and safety committee. But the ultimate responsibility is with the employer, and the employer can set rules, health and safety rules, again after consultation with the health and safety committee, and after that, an employee is then obliged to follow those rules, and the failure to do so is criminalized.
So, in other words, you can be fired for not getting a vaccination.
Yeah. I mean, I feel that employers must be very cautious, and the Occupational Health and Safety Direction, published by the Minister of Labour, Employment and Labour, sets out the process, and an employer would be very wise to comply both letter and spirit with that process. And the process, very briefly, is you have to identify which employees the employer wants to make mandatory, and that identification process is to look at where employees gather. So, for example, for me and my law firm, to require me to be vaccinated, it wouldn't be a reasonable measure because I work now entirely from home. But if you're going into a workplace and you are in physical contact with other employees, then you would identify the group of employees that we would want to make it mandatory. You would have to consult with your health and safety committee. You would then assist employees to register. You would provide transport for employees to go to the nearest site from the workplace. And if you deal with employees who refuse, then you've got to give them full information. And the direction has online documents from the Department of Health, which the employer can then inform the employee. Then if the employee still refuses, the employee must be counseled and warned of the consequences of the position. And then the employee can have call upon their trade union representatives to assist them. And after that, of course, the employer would, and this is the way the rule would work, is that no employee may enter the workplace, without proof of vaccination at a certain date, just in the same way as the employer will not admit an employee to come onto the workplace without a mask or with symptoms, COVID-19 symptoms. So, and then basically the employee wouldn't be allowed onto the premises. That would invoke the common law rule of no work, no pay, and then at a certain point, when if the employee needs to be replaced, when the operational requirements of the workplace are such that you need to replace the employee, then that employee potentially faces dismissal.
Professor, through all of this conversation, we've been talking about a COVID-19 vaccine as if it's just one thing, but it's actually not one thing. There's several different COVID-19 vaccines. Could this conversation get even more complicated if an employer demands you take a particular vaccine, or an employee says, I'll only take a particular vaccine? Or would it be as simple as saying the vaccine that is authorized by the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, and they have the final word?
Well, I would definitely... I don't quite know. I hadn't thought of an employee saying, no, I'll only take the J&J, or I'll only take the Pfizer. But the employer would only require, and I think it would only be reasonable, to require the employees to take any authorized vaccine authorized by the government.
So if it's authorized, it's authorized. There's another angle to this, and I mean, we've been focusing about the law, and that's fine. I mean, you are a lawyer, and that's what we've invited you on to discuss. Sometimes a legal case is not always the best way to resolve a problem in society. Now, the South African Human Rights Commission has essentially asked people to approach them if they're being forced to take a vaccine. I think they have a different view to you. I know of at least one trade union, Solidarity, which says it doesn't believe that its members should be forced to take a vaccine. Again, a different view to you. COSATU agrees with you, as I understand it. What I'm trying to get to is it would seem to me that all of this is going to end up in the Constitutional Court at some point. Now, that could be very useful because we could get clarity on whether your view is correct, and I'm sure it probably is, or whether someone else's view is correct. But a court case also leads to huge divisions in society. There are pluses and minuses to a court case. You ventilate the issues, you ventilate the science. We all remember the mother-to-child transmission, the Nevirapine judgment, for example, how important that was a few, over a decade ago now. But it can also be hugely divisive. Is a court case the best way to go, or should we try persuasion rather than making anything mandatory?
No, not at all. I completely agree with you. The right way to do it is clearly to persuade. I think the government has failed miserably to communicate properly. Using their money to buy hair salons and nail salons. A lot of the difficulty here is that there's not been proper communication, and persuasion is always more legitimate and more effective. So the argument in the first article that Glenda Gray and I published was really, let's just open up the debate so that we can consider different ways in which we can encourage and incentivize people to be vaccinated. So communication is really very important. And one of the ideas that struck me when watching the Springboks play the Lions and the Pumas, that the stands were completely empty. I mean, under the disaster management regulations, they could ease up the restrictions on stadiums, and provided there's social distancing, that only half the stadium can be filled, and proper queuing protocols, and allow stadiums to accept only people who can have proof of vaccination. And if we take soccer and rugby, I mean, that would have an extraordinary effect of people thinking twice and then asking about vaccines, and I assume then getting the kind of information that would make them feel easier about the matter.
Professor Halton Cheadle, good to talk to you, sir. Thank you. Professor Emeritus at the University of Cape Town, a practicing attorney at BCHC.